Hello, everybody. I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes, and welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings. Today, we're going to be talking about William Manchester's A World Lit Only by Fire, The Medieval Mind and the Renaissance Portrait of an Age. This book is not an academic text. This is a book that was written using a great many secondary and tertiary sources, using other people's collective summaries of the Middle Ages, of the medieval period, using other people's biographies and other people's similar sorts of writings. It acts as an overview and a summary, but it was not written by an academic. For an academic audience, it was written for a general audience, which is why, unsurprisingly, it is a national bestseller. The basic theme of the book is how the medieval mind, that is, the mind of people of Europe, how people in Europe changed their perspective and how that shift happened between the medieval period and the Renaissance, because the Renaissance is known historically as a very important turning point. It's known as the turning point where the concept of the individual changed. Before the Renaissance and after the fall of the Roman Empire, the world became, in Europe at least, extremely strided, extremely focused on the role people had been given by God. This was a world that was very much ruled not merely by the church, but by religion and by superstition and by belief about certain issues, not so much of predestination as that you had been given a specific hand and that was the hand you were to play. Contrast this with the American concept now that anybody can become president of the United States. At that time, the idea was if you had been born a peasant, then that was what you were supposed to be, a peasant. And what happened was during the Renaissance, there was this massive shift and this development of belief that if people thought hard enough and worked hard enough, they could change who they were and how things worked. And according to William Manchester, that came out of three major people, or rather two specific individuals, and the third of these individuals is somebody who really acts more as a shorthand. His story acts as a shorthand for the overarching changes that was caused by a particular group. We'll get into that in a moment. So, just because I thought I should do this, this is the picture from the cover, which, if you look up at the top, it has the title Les Vendanges. And Les Vendanges is a tapestry, the original version of which is at Musee de Cluny, which is in France. I don't remember where because I have the memory of a goldfish. If you look online, you can find 1,000,001 people selling imitation copies of this at various places that sell tapestries. So if you want to buy a copy of the tapestry, you can get it for usually about somewhere between $100 to $200 or pounds or whatever your local unit of money is. This is, if you can't completely parse it, a tapestry of winemaking. So over here we have the vineyard, and we have various people collecting grapes and stuff out in the vineyard, and over here we have people stomping on grapes and pouring wine and with a thingy here for another kind of wine press. Just in case anybody is wondering what the picture on the cover is, that's what it is, and now you know. You should thank me for having gone to the effort of figuring that out if you were curious. You probably weren't, were you? Okay, so this is the first person. Desiderius Erasmus was a medieval early Renaissance scholar, and he stands in for the majority of the Renaissance scholars. What happened was, the years before the Renaissance was when people began to rediscover the the Roman and Greek disciplines, Roman and Greek science, Roman and Greek logic, and these various educational and literary and whatnot disciplines that had been lost with the fall of the Roman Empire. And at first, the church was very, very happy to try to fold Plato into what they believed, the concept of the Platonic ideal, that there exists somewhere a higher power who has created these ideal forms, like the Platonic ideal of a rose would be a rose that is all things that roses ought to be, and it exists in some nebulous other world. And these various philosophers and theologians, they began to look at the world not merely through the eyes and dogma of the church, but through looking at the world and philosophy and how to think about things in a much more rational and organized way. And what happened was it eventually led to people starting to buck the authority of the church. Erasmus, although an extremely dedicated Catholic, or follower of the church as it was then, that is the Western Church, because of course the first major schism of the church had happened before that, when with the fall of the Roman Empire, or not long after that, the church had gotten split into two: the Eastern Orthodox Church, which was run out of Constantinople at the time, and the Western Church, which was being run out of Rome. What we now call the Catholic Church was running things, and they were doing a lot of extremely disturbing stuff, which is listed in much greater detail in this book than I'm going to go into. Things, not merely things like the selling of indulgences, that is, pay me enough money and God will forgive your sins, no matter what they do, and some that you do in future, but also things like the Pope having sex with his illegitimate daughter, nay, raping his illegitimate daughters. You can consider how many sins and violations are folded into that one sentence. And Erasmus was, not surprisingly, against that, and had put out a great many writings decrying the actions of the church, decrying the actions of various people, and he was very much in support of rationalism and logic and other such things, and he wound up persecuted, as a great many other people were persecuted, but he stands in for these people in the book. This is the picture that is copied into the book, except that in the book it is a black and white photocopy, and this is the original painting that was photocopied, in effect, for this book, by Hans Holbein the Younger. This next is Martin Luther, not Dr. King, the man who nailed 95 Theses to a church door. The painter is Lucas Cranach. And Martin Luther, the creator of what we now call the Protestant Church today, it turns out he was a extremely, how do I put this? Very poop-oriented, actually. Apparently, he has a lot of writings and letters in which he discusses things like how the devil was trying to drive him into submission or drive him away by throwing poop at him. There's a lot of that in this book, as he explains that Martin Luther, although very dedicated to the church and a great believer in God and a great many other things, was also, in many ways, very much against rationalism and logical thought. He was very polemic and very prolific as a writer, and very exciting and dynamic and clearly highly intelligent, but he was one of those who believed that reason is the enemy of faith. And in some ways it is, of course. But his revolution of driving the church back, of saying the church was wrong, drove another wedge into the medieval mind, because at that time the church was believed to be always right. The church was infallible, like the Pope is supposed to be theoretically infallible. And if the Pope is infallible, and the church run by the Pope is therefore infallible, then it is perfect. And if it is perfect, then it does not need to change. And thus, one of the reasons why the medieval period was very backwards in some very specific ways. It's why there was so little technological and social development over that period, and it relates very much to the fact that if the church is perfect and the church is running everything, then everything is perfect as it is and should be unchanged. And him driving that wedge of saying, no, the church is wrong and the church is a failure, was a tremendous driving force, again, in changing how people saw the world. Because once you shook the church out of its place of primacy in the world, in Europe, it changed how people were thinking. The last person, Ferdinand Magellan, as you can see, I took this from some place that has watermarked this particular photograph. What can you do? The painter here is a complete unknown. Ferdinand Magellan, by circumnavigating the world, by showing the world was bigger than anyone had ever thought, by discovering things that no one had ever seen, by taking his crew to places no one had ever been, all of this stuff, what he did with that was he changed how Europe viewed the world. Because before this, Europe was the center of the world, and there was a little bit of world outside of Europe, off to the, east-ish. There was the Middle East, and somewhere beyond that was Cathay, that is China, Japan, India, Eastern Asia. And suddenly there was this whole other continent. There were all of these people out there who had never even heard of this Christianity thing, of that Jesus guy. They never heard of it. They lived these lives without having seen anything to do with it. And it made Europe suddenly part of a much larger world, and it made Europe much less the center of the world, because there was so much more of the world. And that put the nail in the coffin in terms of the final transition to this outward-looking and much more dynamic Europe that came into being as the 17th century hit and through the 18th century. And this book details it really, really wonderfully. And for all that it was written in 1992, I think it's still a very, very interesting book. And I could not recommend it highly enough for those reasons. I hope this hasn't been too overly intellectual for those who are here to listen to me ramble aimlessly. Thank you all for listening, and I hope to see you next time.